cooperation. The document celebrates the EU's diversity and includes a commitment to attempt a reform of its institutions by 2009. BBC Radio 4 News.
In 45 minutes, Claire Balding meets another rare breed of dog whose talents include tracking humans for sport or rescue, detecting cancer and, once upon a time, bagging otters. The tale of the otter hound can be heard at 2:45. First, it's Gardener's Question Time. Here's the chairman, Eric Robson.
This week you find us in the wide open spaces of the most sparsely populated county in the southeast of England. 40% of it is designated an area of outstanding natural beauty or an area of high landscape value. Surprising, then, that it's named after a muddy ford used to get herds of cattle across the River Isis. Because, to give it its full title, we're in Oxfordshire. So, to continue with proper names, let Eric Bell Robson introduce John Aloysius Cushnie, Pippa Maud Greenwood, and Bob Bismarck Flowerdew. Namely, your Oxfordshire Gardener's Question Time panel. And later in the programme, we'll be heading off to our southern garden at Sparshield College in Hampshire. Peter Gibbs and Anne Swithenbank are already there. So what do you have planned this week?
Well, Eric, we're going to be doing what every gardener's doing this time of year. That's sowing seeds. But, Anne, what are we looking at in particular?
Well, really, what sort of container to sow them into? Because there are just so many. You go to the garden centre and there are modules and pots and trays. And, of course, you can use your yoghurt pots and recycle those. So it's which one to choose to make it work best for you.
There we go, Eric. All will be revealed.
Thanks, Peter. And Bob, you'll be joining them. I hear you doing tomato-y sort of things.
Yes, with the odd springs we're getting, I think we're sowing our tomatoes too early for the outside crop, so I'm going to try a different time.
All that in about half an hour, but who has our first question, please?
Reverend Ernie Hanson, Morton Marsh. I have a Cotswold allotment on which I would like to plant a plum tree so that I can make delicious jam and wine during autumn and winter. Which variety of plum would you recommend I plant? When is the best time to plant it? And do I need to plant more than one for pollination? How long before I can expect a good crop?
Which plum, how to do it, when to get a good crop? Bismarck.
Oh, could we have Count Bismarck, please?
Sorry, Your Royal Highness.
Right, first of all, you're on fairly limey, chalky soil here, which is absolutely suited to plums. However, you're fairly high up and you have fairly late frosts, which are not very good for plums. And you want something, you only want one, preferably, yes?
Yeah.
I mean, it would be better always to have more plums, because even the ones that are self-fertile usually do better when there's others about.
Right.
But if I remember rightly, Marjorie seedling is self-fertile. It's a very good plum. You can use it either for cooking or for eating. But the best thing about it is it's very, very late flowering, and so it's likely to miss the late frosts, and you'll probably get a crop most years.
Wonderful.
Pippa?
When it comes to planting time, I like to buy fruit trees bare root because I think they tend to be the best, most vigorous plants and those which establish best. So really it's on the late side for planting bare root now because most things are starting to come into leaf. I would prefer to plant, say, January, February time, as long as the soil wasn't either frozen or really wet.
And John?
Yeah, and on that, if you have to plant now and you're going for one in a container, make sure it's container grown, not containerized. And the best way to check that is when you go to the garden centre, when nobody's looking, give it a wee bit of a tug. And if it seems like it's going to come out of the pot, don't buy it. It should really have its own root ball. I'd be different to Bob. I would go for Czar. Because while Czar is slightly earlier flowering, it's a wonderful plum. It's brilliant for cooking, and yet you can still pick it from the tree and eat it. Wonderful thing. The only thing to remember is always prune them in the summertime. Not like other fruit which are pruned in the winter. Prune them in the summer to avoid diseases.
Does it make good wine?
Why would you? I mean, you can go and only a reverend could ask. You can go to your local, whatchamacallit, down the road, and for £3 you'll get a better bottle of wine than you'll ever make. You cannot get your own plum off your own tree and just bite into it, and the juice and the wasps running down both sides of your face. Incredible, mister.
Bob?
Forget about the wine. Take the right plums, put them in a bottle, and then cover them with rum or whisky. And make it, it's like slow gin, but 10 times better.
And I'll come to communion.
And if you're doing the jam, just make sure before you leave to get our address so you can send us some.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. Lady next.
Anne Cooper from Hook Norton. Can you help me to grow successful basil? Nothing I do seems to work.
What goes wrong with it?
Everything.
Well, you mean it just dies?
It just dies. It dies in the greenhouse, it dies on the windowsill, it dies everywhere.
Right. How can you keep it alive a bit longer? Pippa?
Basil is very prone to damping off infections, which is the sort of thing that will attack a lot of seedlings, but because it's a warm climate plant, because it's particularly intolerant of over-wet compost conditions, it goes down more easily. And if you're not getting much past germination stage, or perhaps seedlings a couple of centimetres tall or so, then I would think that's what you've got. So I would say better drained compost, keep it a little bit drier, obviously not so dry that the plants can't grow. But remember, with a lot of herbs, you actually get a more concentrated flavour if you're a little bit mean to them and you don't grow them too soft. It's like the things you buy from the supermarket. They may be very tender and soft, but they've got a kind of built-in timer, self-destruct on them, haven't they? And that's because they're grown so very soft.
So's Anne's basil.
Well, it sounds like it hasn't. I think it's the same problem. It's too soft. So be a bit meaner on it. The only other thing I would say is if you are trying to ever grow it outside, do make sure you're in with reliably warm nights as well as warm days, because otherwise it tends to be hit, like anything, by a little bit of cold wind. And also, in my experience, by passing tomcats. There's something about the smell of basil that's very reminiscent of cat, isn't there? Though I love basil and cats. And the two don't seem to mix and they get sprayed.
John?
And I'm going to annoy you because I don't even like this stuff, but I grow it. And I can grow it dead easy. Don't start too early. Pippa says it doesn't like it cold. Give it, once it's germinated, give it lots of light. Keep down on the water. Give it maximum light. You even grow it in the windowsill until you're well into the summer. That way you stand a good chance. I would even go for the Greek basil, which seems to me to be hardier than the rest, funnily enough. But the reason I grow it is that I get white fly in my tomatoes. And if you put basil in there, it's the one thing they prefer to tomatoes. So when I see them all in the basil, I take the basil out, and I'll not tell you what to do it in case somebody likes white fly. But I get rid of 90% of the white fly in my greenhouse just by getting them all to go to the basil, and then I burn the plant.
And Bob?
Yes, like John was saying, the Greek is very good, and the Genovese as well. The smaller leaved ones tend to be a little better than the bigger leaved ones. I also find the purple, the reddish purple one, to be a little tougher than the ordinary green one, so try different varieties. And Anne, can I check, you are using a proper sowing compost, aren't you? You're looking guilty.
Possibly. I don't know.
Possibly. OK, may I suggest that you go out and buy the very most expensive brand new sowing compost.
Right.
Never economise on sowing compost, particularly with something that's not awfully hardy like basil.
Okay.
There we are.
Thank you.
Some suggestions for you. Better luck this year.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, another question?
Sue Lewis, Middle Barton. What do you suggest they do with my front garden? In the last 12 months, it has had temperatures of 95 degrees Fahrenheit and also 6 inches of snow.
Move house? Well, we're going to be asking the plants to put up with quite a bit in this garden. The extremes are considerable. What sort of things would you suggest to go there? Bob?
Well, I wouldn't worry too much about it, Sue, because although climate warming is definitely going to be a problem for us, what's actually happening at the moment, the variations are all well within the variations we've had in the last 50 years or so, near enough from the point of view of the plants. Yes, it's going to change, but right now, almost all the plants that we've ever recommended are still quite okay for those sort of situations. The ones we've been growing for the last 50 years are used to having the odd colder winter than we've been having, and they're used to having had the odd hotter summer. Yes, sure, drought kills them, and sure, frost and damp conditions will kill some of them, but the vast majority of the things we've always grown, we will still be able to grow for certainly a decade or so, unless something changes very much more rapidly than it is at the moment.
So are you saying that the plants that you would normally get in your garden can cope quite happily with 97 degrees and 6 inches of snow?
No, they won't suffer any more than they did back in 1976. Yeah. I mean, most of our gardens got turned into brown pyres and very dead in 76, but by 78 or 79, they were back again. Yeah. And it's the same, that at the moment we don't have to worry too much about looking for different plants. In fact, it would be a mistake to try and change our planting too radically.
So nothing much to worry about, Pippa?
I don't think there is. No, I think we happen to get snow this winter, but how often do we get snow? It's certainly not every winter. And yes, your 95 degrees Fahrenheit, I think you mentioned, is pretty high. But if you're growing plants which are naturally sun lovers and perhaps drought lovers, most of the time they're going to be fine.
Well, it's interesting, you see, that we've strayed onto the question of climate change, because that is a sort of undercurrent. It's the sort of ghost in the machine behind so many questions we're asked these days. And I'd like to ask you all a question here. How many people here have a beech hedge? How many people? A good 20, 30 people with beech hedges? Well, I've got to say, don't get too attached to them, because they may not survive much longer. And if you're thinking of planting a beech hedge and you live in the south, forget that idea too and find something different. These dire warnings, as if you needed telling, are all tied up with the aforementioned climate change, and if predictions are right, in the years to come, beech hedges in the south of England will become as rare as hen's teeth. So will you please welcome someone who knows all about this? That's Tony Russell, the former head forester at Weston Burt Arboretum and now one of Europe's leading tree consultants. Well, Tony, a bit scaremongering?
I'd like to say it was, but unfortunately it isn't. The dear old beech, one of the nation's native trees which we love and take to our heart, really is going to be under threat over the next 50 years or so.
Why particularly beech?
Because it has a very shallow root system, and that's why it's grown on shallow soils, and those are the soils which dry out so quickly during times of drought. And if you think back to 1987 and 1990, those great gales we had, what was the tree which blew over more than any other? It was beech, because it has such a shallow root system. And of course, in times of drought, the first part of the soil to dry out is that area immediately near the surface. And that's where the roots of the beech tree are, and they just can't get enough moisture.
So what sort of time scale are we talking about here before beech in the south of England becomes a rarity?
Well, if we take the predictions which are being made, by 2050 we'll have an increase of average climate in terms of temperature of about 1.5 to 3 degrees centigrade. But more importantly, we will have lost about a third of our annual summer rainfall, and that's the important thing. So by 2050, if those things happen, then beech really will be in short supply in the south and east of Britain.
So what specific area are we talking about? If you draw a line on a map, where would that line go, below which it's inadvisable to be planting beech now?
It's going to be very difficult to say, because it really depends just how the predictions come true in terms of climate change. But if you're looking at areas on free draining soil, on the green sands, if you drew a line from, say, Hampshire across to East Anglia, anything south of that, on shallow soils particularly, that's where beech are going to be under threat.
Are people who are the experts in this, you know, the people who are doing a lot of plantings, already beginning to take this on board?
Yeah, absolutely. People like the Forestry Commission, the Arboricultural Association, the Royal Horticultural Society, the Ecological Department for Studies in this country are all saying that where you can, you should be looking at planting other trees other than beech.
But I mean, think of someone like the Royal Parks, for example. I mean, they do planting. They have a rolling programme of planting. Would they be planting beech now?
No, they've already stopped. In fact, they're not planting replacement trees of beech or oak. And what they're putting in are trees which are more likely to survive in a Mediterranean-style climate.
So what sort of varieties do gardeners have that they can turn to if beech is out the window?
If beech is out the window as a tall tree, then you should be looking at something like holm oak, evergreen oak, walnut, sweet chestnut. All these trees come originally from Mediterranean regions, and they're the ones which are going to thrive and not just survive in a warming Britain.
And what about hedging plants?
Yeah, in terms of hedging, the ideal plant to go for is hornbeam, which looks very much like beech. It has a brown leaf in winter which stays on the actual hedge. It doesn't blow off, but it copes much better with high temperatures and lots of dry periods during summer.
Thank you very much indeed.
No problem at all.
Tony Russell. There we are. Who's got our next question?
Suzanne Stogden. I'm planning to grow Tagetes minuta in my garden this year, as I've heard it can clear areas of ground elder and bindweed. Have the panel any experience of this plant? Might it damage other plants in the border or be invasive? I don't want to replace one problem with another.
Bob.
Yes, Suzanne, this is a wonderful plant. It's from Mexico, and indeed it will not only kill off ground elder, it'll even kill off almost all other weeds underneath it by choking them out with intense shade. It gives off root secretions that kill all sorts of the parasitic nematodes, eelworms that cause problems with our crops. The only thing is, have you actually read the packet yet?
No,
Okay, do you know why it's called Minuta?
because it's very big.
That's right. You're very clever, Suzanne. You've worked out exactly how nomenclatural botanists work. Yes, Minuta, because the flowers are tiny. It's actually 6 or 7 feet tall. It's 2 or 3 times the height of the African marigolds. You started off in the greenhouse in individual pots or cells and planted out once the weather's warmed up at about a foot and a half apart. And then as it grows, provided you can get it established, it will choke out everything underneath it. And then at the end of the season, you cut it down and compost it. However, I must say I gave up using it. It is very big, it's very demanding on the soil, it's actually a little tender compared to the others, and, well, it's a thug. But it doesn't spread anywhere or self-seed, so you needn't worry about that.
Thank you.
Would you grow, John?
I never have, but after what Bob said, I never will. I mean, really, you see, I find ground elder, of all the weeds, not to be too bad. It's a fairly modest weed. It'll spread, but it doesn't get big. It spreads quite slowly, and you can, if you put a barrier up, you can't get rid of it, but you can stop it going any further because it's not deep rooting. So ground elder would be the least of my problems. I mean, horsetail would be convolvulus, balsam, Japanese knotweed. I can think of an awful lot of weeds much worse than ground elder. So just put up with it, and if you ever get gout, it'll cure it.
What about these using plants like this, Pippa?
Certainly the work that's been done on it and the people I know who have grown it say that it does do what it's said to do. I haven't grown it myself, but it is these root exudates or secretions that it produces that have a very dramatic effect, as well as the shading. A lot of plants do this. It's their sort of self-defense mechanism. But I quite agree with Bob. It's also going to have a very big effect on the moisture and the nutrient levels in the soil. But if you don't want to use chemicals and you want to cure a bit of land and you've got a bit of time, then it's a pretty good way.
But interestingly, I mean, these exudations that are coming from the roots of this plant, if they're going to go for nematodes, will that effect last from season to season?
The exudations don't last very long. All these things, they're all transitory. Plants take things in and they give them out through the roots. And sometimes they exude minerals back into the soil. It's been shown that some plants have more potash in them before maturity than they do at maturity. They've got rid of it. So things are always going back into the soil, but they're transitory. They don't last.
The choice is yours, dear lady.
Thank you.
Yeah, it seems to work in a way. But do you want to give your garden over to them?
No.
Thank you very much. Onwards and upwards.
Sally Sale from Swinford. I'd like to ask the team if there's a secret to growing greengages. I've tried on numerous occasions in the Thames Valley without success. My soil is neutral to alkaline with a high water table. I get a crop and they're little, hard greengages and then they just drop off.
And they drop off the trees.
Yeah.
What's causing that, Bob?
First of all, what sort of greengage did you get? Did you buy a named variety, or have you got a seedling?
It was a named variety on each occasion.
It was a named variety?
Yes.
OK. Certainly, I mean, there's some that are better than others. I've got a Rain Claude, which I think is absolutely the very best, but I would do. There are a lot of different greengages. Some are better than others. I find the Cambridge gauge often fruits very lightly for me. But you say that you do get fruits, but they're tiny.
Very tiny and then hard, and then they drop.
Is it a very dry soil?
No.
It's not?
No,
It's wet.
because we've got we were right by the River Thames.
Ah. So possibly the roots could be drowning in winter.
That's what I wondered.
I think that's most likely. And they won't take waterlogging in winter. It'll kill off the roots. It'll mean the tree doesn't have much reserves. That does strike me as being very likely then.
Pippa?
I'm sure root death is a big part of it, but I'm also a bit worried, aren't you, Bob, about the fact that the fruitlets are actually forming and then dropping almost to a man by the sounds of it. I mean, that almost sounds as if there is some either damage to the flower going on or fault of pollination. So you get the start of the fruit forming, but then normally when a fruit has been pollinated, when a flower has been pollinated, it's got viable potential seed inside it, it sends out, if you like, hormonal messages which cause the fruit to swell. If something goes wrong, it doesn't send out those messages, and you get a sort of skinny bit of flesh around that they're developing seed. And I suspect that if you were to cut open some of those, you'd probably find there wasn't much in the way of seed within the stone. And I don't know what it is from what you've said. Perhaps the spot's a bit too windy, perhaps for some reason you aren't getting the pollinators in. But I think you've got a problem at pollination as well.
John?
Yeah, although I would go back to the water, to the high water table, because, all right, the roots, they're not enjoying it, they're rotting, but it's really in the spring whenever the plant is trying to produce leaves, and they're not early with their leaves gauges, and is trying to produce flower, and is trying to turn that flower into fruit. I think that's when the roots can no longer cope with it, and the plant is just saying, look, you're not giving us enough, and the roots are saying, well, there's not enough of us to give it to you, and so it drops its fruit. I think in a severe case it will also start dropping leaves, but I really do think it's a water problem.
But if you really want green gauges, if Sally really wants green gauges badly enough, if she mounded the site, took the roots up out of the water a bit, would that work? Would that help?
Well, Sally, how long have you had the tree?
Oh, I've had several.
You've had several?
Yes.
And you've lost them all?
Well, in the sense that I don't lose the tree, but it doesn't fruit.
It doesn't fruit. Well, then the best thing would be to try and make a raised mound and plant up on a raised mound so that the roots have at least a foot or two of soil before they hit the damp soil underneath. That will probably give you... And plant 2 or 3 at the same time to cover the pollination problems.
And maybe try and create some sort of barrier against wind, because I'm convinced that the site may be a bit too gusty for good pollination as well.
Yeah.
Something to try, Sally.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, another question, please.
Lorna Aldrich. My utility room window faces east. The view to our cottage garden is ruined by an oil tank one side of a paved area and the boiler on the other. What could be planted to screen these and give joy to the beholder? And all year round interest if possible, but not a Russian vine, thank you.
No, unless you want the entire house to disappear.
No.
Some suggestions, please. John?
The one plant that you have to go for is Chenomelies. The quince, the flowering quince, it'll be in flower now. If you plant it against something like an oil tank, it'll get up to about 5.5 foot high. You can go for crimson and gold, which is a lovely variety. You can go for Morelzii. There are dozens of varieties. You can go for Jack, which is white. You'll get pink, red, crimson, white flowers. You'll even get the quinces, which are as hard as rock, but when you cook them, you can make sort of things like jam out of them. That's tough. And it's the one plant that might, and you have to bear this in mind, it might withstand a bit of oil spillage. If the chap who's filling your tank is a wee bit careless and spills a drop of oil, Chenomelies won't be the first plant to go down with. So that would be nice. At this time of the year, it would be a red of colour.
And Pippa?
Well, I hardly dare say this, but at home we've quite successfully used beech hedging, actually, around 2 sides of the oil tank. And then on the other side, what we did was use hurdles, which are horrendously, short-lived, to be absolutely honest. So perhaps it would have been better to use a decentish-looking type of trellis. And then trained onto that a fairly rapid growing clematis, and I was thinking of one of the Clematis montana. If you go for something like Clematis montana Frida, you've got a lovely purpley bronzy brown leaf with a contrasting pink flower, and it's not quite so rampant. But the advantage to that is that if you then use at least one side onto trellis, that you can winch round a bit, because occasionally people want to have access to your oil tank and they get very sniffy when they can't get at it due to planting. So it would be worth having something you can just move out of the way slightly on trellis.
Hi, Bob.
First of all, Lorna, is it a metal or a plastic tank?
A plastic one.
Thank goodness for that. With metal ones, never put any plants close to them because it can cause dampness and then corrosion. And also, I really wouldn't put any plants closer than a couple of feet to an oil tank, just for safety. Because just in a hot summer, they could catch lights, hedging and so on. Beech in particular, I would never put anywhere near an oil tank. But, it's so prone to drying out with all those leaves underneath. I mean, unless you want a good insurance claim at some point. How big a gap is
I'm
there?
not entirely sure you can be suggesting that, Bob.
Okay,
I'll read the small print of your BBC contract.
Well, I'm not suggesting it. I'm just saying that it's not in your mind, is it? No, good.
No,
a very large planter stood up on top of a raise to raise it up, and again with lots, because if it's something in the middle that's very bright, full of colour, it will pull your eye from the things on either side. And I don't think you've got the space to put a hedge or trellis work or much in there without making it too cramped.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Some suggestions there for you. Yes, on we go.
Penny Morley, Appleton Gardening Club. Our annual garden club show, the first week in September, has a new class, a bucket of homemade compost. Is it too late to start making compost especially for this event? And if not, can the team suggest some quick rotting prize-winning ingredients, please?
Right. The Bucket of Homemade Compost Award. Is it too... You're not pulling my leg, are you? This is...
Not my idea.
Is there anyone else here who can testify that this is true? Right. Is it too late to start, Bob?
Well, there are very quick ways of making compost. In particular, if you take any materials and chop them up really fine, hire a shredder, put them through a shredder, mix in a great big sack full of bloodfish and bone meal, as many grass clippings as you can lay your hands on, some shredded newspaper, all that sort of soft stuff. Keep it really moist and pack it into something really well insulated. I've used a dead deep freezer, an old refrigerator, as a hot box for this, because it's insulated. You put the stuff in, it gets tremendously hot. You then take it out, mix it up, put it back. You can actually produce pretty good, well-rotted compost within the month. But it does require a lot of mixing and a lot of fine stuff. Otherwise, it's about 6 months.
Pippa?
I think you'll just have to get on the committee and make sure it's on for next year as well, because I think you've got 5 months, really, haven't you now? And I think 5 months is cutting it a bit fine, unless you go down the sort of complex route that Bob's suggesting.
Which will be every waking minute, you understand.
No, every waking hour. You know, once a week, go out there, give it a stir. You don't need to do an awful lot to it.
Once a week, and you'll have it ready in a month.
If you're making a small batch and you mix it once a week, it'll cook so quick you won't believe it.
John?
Yeah, I'll go Bob's route, but I would use layers of cabbage leaves. And then I would use shredded paper, layers of cabbage leaves, shredded paper, and then I would hit the whole lot with dried blood. Just dried blood. I mean, it becomes liquid as soon as you put water on it. I would use boiling water to dissolve it. I'd put that on it, keep doing that, drain it off, put more on it, and within 3 weeks you will have something that just needs another week sitting somewhere to dry out. And if you get a sunny period, just spread it out on old newspaper or something, and you will have fantastic compost. There's no doubt about it. The only other thing you can do if you really want to beat the judges, and I mean the trouble is, are any of your other friends entering for this?
Oh, I expect the whole of the gardening club will try.
Right, okay. Well then, what I would suggest you do that they don't do is that you go and buy some orchid compost. And you do exactly the same with that. You hit that with dried blood. And within 10 days, you'll have compost that'll baffle the judges. They'll be giving you rosettes all round the place. But for goodness sake, don't go home and put it round your orchids.
Thank you very much.
Righto. Do contact us and let us know if you win.
I don't know, I'm sorry.
Oh. I thought we could have shared the prize, but...
No.
Just the glory.
Penny, contact us and let us know about the glory. All right.
I will.
Thank you. Yes, the gentleman there.
Peter Fisher, Borton's Gardening Club. How can I control Philadelphus? We've got several of these, about 30 years old. They've been neglected over the years. They flowered nicely each year, but they're now too big. About 4 years ago, I had a go at 2 of them, cut out a lot of the old wood, and reduced the height of the newer wood by about 1/3. They look a lot neater, but they haven't flowered since. What should I do with the others? Should I just leave them alone, or have you got a better idea?
Right, the curse of the overgrown Philadelphus, and more to the point, the curse of the cut-down Philadelphus. Presumably it's the pruning that stopped the other ones from flowering.
Yeah, I mean, you did exactly the right thing. I mean, the one thing about Philadelphus, the mock orange, with an incredible perfume and usually white flowers, sometimes with a little blotch, mauvey blotch to the base of them. But they will tolerate hard pruning. Lots of other things, if you stump them, they just up and die. But Philadelphus will stand it. But what you should have done was do it over about a 3-year period. It sounds like virginal. Virginal will get to 30 foot high, where you've got a creak in your neck trying to look up and see the flowers. If you'd have cut that down over about 3 years or 4 years, take a quarter of the branches off, right down to within 2 or 3 foot of the ground, let those grow up, the next year do it. Over 4 years, by now, the original ones you'd done would have settled down and they would be flowering again. So don't do it all at the one time, but certainly have a go at it.
Bob?
Yes, if they've been in 30 years, did you feed them after you pruned them?
No, I'm afraid I didn't.
Well, I think that might help no end. If they've been in there 30 years, they're going to need some compost and well-rotted manure to get them going again, and they probably could do with a bit of potash if they're not flowering, so maybe some wood ashes, and I'm sure they'll come back for you. But John's right, prune over several stages. If you take all the wood away, there's nothing left to flower, but they will produce new flowering wood fairly quickly.
Grand.
Great, thanks.
There we are. So you know what to do with the other ones, and a bit of tender loving care to the ones you've butchered.
Come back in 5 years and tell you how it's gone.
Do that. Thank you very much. Let's have your topical tips now. Bob first.
Well, as you clear away the last of the winter roots, don't throw them on the compost heap. Save them up, because cut up beetroot, if you cut them in half, hollow them out. The same with parsnips and big carrots. Make fantastic slug traps for free. Just put them down beside your new sowings and plantings, and you'll be able to turn them over and pull out the slugs every other day when you walk around the garden.
And Pippa.
It's time to go on an aphid patrol. Go looking for green fly and black fly, because at this time of year they're very much out and about, but in small numbers. They haven't started breeding and multiplying yet. So catch them now and you'll save yourself a lot of work later on, and you'll save your plants a lot of damage.
And John.
Don't delay pruning your bush roses. If they're new plants, you can cut them back to about 3 or 4 buds and get rid of all the little stems that are thinner than pencil thickness. With established roses, prune them down, don't forget to feed them, and remember, always prune them in the direction you want the bud to grow.
And is it going to be great weather for rose pruning? Let's see what the weather forecast is for us gardeners over the next few days. Over now live to London and the BBC Weather Centre for the Gardener's Question Time Gardening Weather Forecast.
Yep, the presence of BST, British Summertime, has kicked us into summer. Well, almost. It's far better than yesterday in Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire in particular. A bit of greyness still left on the North Cornwall coast and around the coast of Aberdeenshire and the central lowlands of Scotland. Otherwise, today, 9 to 11 degrees. Tomorrow is a bit warmer with a lighter wind. Tuesday, the warmest day of this coming week. We expect quite possibly 17 degrees Celsius somewhere in the home counties. That's 63 Fahrenheit, but typically it will be in the low teens. Of course, that means clear skies by day. Although the nights are now shorter than days, there's a chance of a bit of a frost. Not so much tonight, except for Highland Scotland, but for Monday night and Tuesday night, almost anywhere could get just a slight frost. But then a change to the weather takes place midweek. On Wednesday, the Atlantic weather takes over. You could get showers anywhere, some of them big on Wednesday. That, of course, prevents a frost Wednesday night. And on Thursday, just to remind you, it's only just BST. A cold wind could even bring wintry showers to bits of Wales. Now back to Eric.
Thank you very much. We have time for one final question here in Oxfordshire.
John Snelling. My girlfriend is an avid gardener, and I like to provide support for her by joining her in the allotment with a folding chair and a good book. Can the panel suggest any ways that I can be of more assistance without straying too far from the comfort of my seat?
And you don't want to go bad back or anything, do you? I mean, no.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Tasks for the gardener's mate. Bob.
Writing out the labels.
Pippa.
I think you're probably safer sticking to your chair. If I was her, I'd keep you there, I think.
Oh, thanks. She did buy me a pair of wellies.
For sitting down in.
Do they have concrete soles? Yeah. Make sure she doesn't take any rivers. John?
John, the crowd here, they just don't appreciate the subtleness of having to give someone who's not as good as you the chance to better themselves. I think you continue to sit there, offer to shell the peas, something like that. I mean, something that's really going to be very useful. And do bear in mind that if you're going to read a book, you've got to have it hidden behind a horticultural book.
So, a horticultural textbook with the spy thriller inside it. And lots of words of encouragement and advice.
Always.
Always.
Send me an invitation to the wedding if it ever happens.
And when somebody says, that bit where I get around to saying, do you know any just impediment? Pippa Greenwood's going to be on her feet, sticking up for lady gardeners. But time to go off to safer pastures now, off to our own garden in the south, to Sparshield College, where Anne Swithenbank is with Peter Gibbs.
Thanks, Eric. Well, it's that time of year when we're frantically breaking out the seed packets, trying to get ahead of the game and finding some containers to put those seeds in. And that's what Anne Swithenbank and I are going to have a look at first of all here at Sparshoot College. Anne, you've got a huge array of containers here. How do we choose the best ones for particular seeds?
Well, if everyone's like me, their greenhouses will be packed to the gunnels, and so it's crucial to use all that space properly. And there are more sowings to do, and you stand there with the packet and you think, shall I put it into a small pot? Shall I sow them into cells? Shall I make up some of those little pots that absorb water? What shall I put them in? And you go to the shops and you see all of this that we have in front of us. There are modules with small rigid cells there. There are larger ones. There are some that fix together. Quite nice long ones.
Yes, these are relatively new, aren't they?
Yes.
With the sort of grooves that make the roots penetrate down.
That's right, yeah, very good for sweet peas, the longer ones are. And you have to try and choose which one is going to be the best. And really you have to look at what your growing system is like and what you're growing. At home I have a greenhouse with a propagating case, and early in the season, I started sowing in February and March with some things, peppers, tomatoes, antirrhinums, the things that need a long growing season. They need heat to germinate, so they've got to go in the propagating case. Now if I was to sow them into the modules, great, you might think, one or perhaps two seeds per module, no pricking out, and you can thin them down to one.
But you'd only get one lot in there.
I'd only be able to get one lot of plants at a time into the propagating case because of the space it takes up. So I tend to sow into 3.5-inch pots at that stage of the game. And then I will have to prick out into little seed trays or individual pots or modules later.
There's a slight downside to that, isn't there, that the plants can get a check during the pricking out?
That's true, but it means that I can get ahead with all of the earlier sowings I need to make. So those that need the heat go into the smaller pots, all crammed into the warm propagating case because the greenhouse is too cold for germination for them. But of course, early in the season there are other seeds that are hardier. So if you're growing your onions, your sweet peas, some of the brassicas, you can sow those into the modules and have them out on the greenhouse staging and they will still come up. So it's just a question of knowing what's going to happen and what needs the heat. And that way you are saving yourself time because you don't need to transplant them. And of course those plants don't have a check.
And you don't have to use the commercially available containers, either, do you? Yoghurt pots, that sort of thing. People use all sorts of things.
That's right, yes. I mean, it's reusing things, isn't it? Sometimes it's hard to recycle these plastic items. So if you've got them, always make a drainage hole in the base, though, because these will hold water, and you'll just end up with a swamp for your plants to grow in. And all the margarine tubs and coffee cups, anything that you can get hold of.
And matching the size of container to the size of the seed, is that quite important?
Yes, as the season progresses, you don't need to use the propagating case so much, so you can do more and more intermodules on the staging. And with larger seeds like sweet corn, I sometimes sow those into smaller modules first and then take them and pop them on into pots before they even get to the garden, or just so that they can get to a good size, but never let them get pot bound. Things like pumpkin seeds, which are nice and large, will go straight into 3.5-inch pots and then into the garden.
Whereas something like the antirrhinum we've got here, a very small fiddly seed, you don't really want to be doing that into individual modules.
No, and they'd go in early anyway, so it's really a question of balancing what you want to grow with the facilities you've got.
OK, and I'll leave you to get on with that. You've got plenty more
I've got
to do.
plenty to do.
And staying with the seed theme, well, I've got Bob Flowerdew here at the other end of the table. Bob, you've got a theory about sowing tomatoes, haven't you?
Well, the trouble is, you see, the conventional advice is given, and you see it on the packets, to sow outdoor tomato crops from beginning of March. Well, that seems fine, and you keep them in the greenhouse. They've got to be kept in the warm. You've got to pop them up. You've got to disbud them. The trouble is, at the beginning of May to the middle of May, we plant them out. Now, what I've noticed is that these plants are very big. They get checked by all the potting on, and when you plant them out in the ground, they just stall. They don't move at all for weeks until the soil's warmed up. Whereas one year I missed that sowing. I didn't sow for a whole month, and those that I sowed late, they were smaller plants. When I put them out, they grew away much more quickly because they hadn't been stalled. So what I've set up is this trial. It's relatively simple. Conventionally, we'd already have sown some outside tomatoes already.
Yes.
So we've got a couple of lots going, and we're going to sow another little batch of tomato seedlings every week for the next couple of weeks. So we'll then have about half a dozen batches a week apart, and we're going to plant them all out in the beginning of May, middle of May, when the weather seems warm enough to plant them out. And we're going to see which ones do best.
So some will be well advanced in the pots, others will just be starting to get away
Exactly.
when they actually go out into the ground.
Exactly, and I've got a theory that the ones that haven't been in pots for so long, because they're a little bit more vigorous and smaller, will adapt quicker and will grow away, and by about the beginning of July, we should see those hopefully being the better plants.
And looking on is Rosie Yeomans, senior lecturer here at Sparshall, who, once again, Rosie, is going to have to do all this work for Bob.
I know, I was just thinking about how much potting on I'm going to have to do, because if we're successfully sowing week by week, the initial sowings are going to get quite large under protection, and they'll probably need to go into 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 litre pots, which is quite big.
Well, that's one of the
Planting
problems
out.
I've found, is that we can't plant out. The plants keep growing and they get big, and then you do have the problem of where to put them. But more of a problem is that in those big pots, they do still stall. They're not the same as growing in the ground.
They get a bit root bound, don't they? So it'll be interesting to see whether they grow out of that or whether the younger plants, when they go out, actually will establish better.
And of course we can add another dimension to these trials now with our new northern garden at Harlow Carr up near Harrogate. And listening in is Sarah Darley at Harlow Carr. Sarah, what are you going to be doing?
Peter, we're raring to go up here in Yorkshire. We traditionally sow a little bit later up here. We found, especially with last year in the spring being so very, very cold, I mean, we had frosts in May last year, which was rather unusual, that we get better plants if we sow a little bit later. So it'll be fascinating to see come July what kind of plants we have in comparison to Sparshall. Looking forward to it.
Right, so we'll look forward to that, but now, Rosie, time to look back to a trial that we started in the autumn. You've got some pots here on the edge of the patio. Shall we go down and have a look? Just remind us what we were trying to do here.
Well, do you remember the last time I saw you was late October, and I thought you'd all gone completely mad because you wanted me to sow winter greens or the sorts of greens which would germinate and overwinter, and normally the last sowings are sort of mid-September.
I think our heads were turned by that long, warm
I thought
autumn.
you were all barking mad doing this, but it was interesting because they all germinated.
Really?
And here they are.
They're looking good.
They have sat here over the winter. I did use some fleece because we had 1 or 2 frosts, but they've all grown very well. What I do think is that you need an awful lot of them to make it worthwhile.
Right.
Amazing that they germinated at that time. I think, it was very mild conditions then, wasn't it? And fantastic that they've carried on growing. But to be honest, if I cropped those right now, I'd probably get a sandwich, wouldn't I?
They are rather small, yes, sort of a couple of inches at best, most of them.
Containers, and so it's nice to have on the patio here. But they're not going to produce a massive crop. And even if I were to gingerly take a few leaves off them, it's not long now before they'd really bolt and they're gone over.
Have you cropped them at all through the winter?
No, not much. I have actually cropped the odd leaf and stuck it in my sandwich because the mustard particularly is really, really nice. But no, I haven't come out here with the snippers and tried to fill a bag.
So occasional grazing maybe,
Exactly.
but it's not going to fill your salad bowl very
but
often.
had we done an entire veg patch with it, then sure, you'd have got, greens for a long time.
And it has, of course, been quite a mild winter, hasn't it? So that must have helped things along.
Yes, and I think we should make it clear that these things are mustard, rocket, and some of the sort of spicy mixes that you get from some of the seed companies, all germinated well and taste very good.
OK, so worth a try, but don't expect fantastic results.
Yes, I think you've got to do a lot to make it worthwhile.
OK, thanks, Rosie. Well, that's all from us here at Sparshall for now, so Eric, back to you.
Thanks, Peter. Next week we're with gardeners in Hertfordshire, and in Sunday's programme we'll be returning to Sparshall College when Bob Flowerdew conducts a pre-soaking pea trial, and Pippa Greenwood explains how to ensure a clear pond with a little pre-season maintenance. All that next week. Till then, from me, Eric Robson, goodbye and good gardening.
Gardener's question time. Question time.